Hey, what's up? Jason here from Unity3D.college. Today we're going to talk about UI interactions and just cover the basics. We're going to go through the process of building a simple quiz system where you can present some questions and let your users select an answer, maybe pop up some text there, and then move on to the next question. You notice that the buttons are dynamically changing here, the answers are showing up there, and it's all relatively straightforward, but there's a lot to this stuff, so let's get started. Now I want to start off by saying that if you're already a very experienced Unity developer, you're already a pro, this probably isn't the video for you, so just go ahead and hit subscribe, hit the alerts, and wait for the next video. If you're just getting started out though, or you're just new to the UI system, this should be perfect and give you a kind of fundamental understanding of how to set things up, or at least one way to do that. So let's go through this sample scene first, and then we'll dive into the code. The first thing that you notice here is that we have a main camera and a canvas. When I created this project, I just created a new 2D project, so I didn't get a directional light. That's why you don't see the light in here, because it was set up as 2D. If we go to the scene view, you'll see that it's also in 2D mode, although I didn't really need to use the scene view for this. Underneath this, we have, or I guess in this project, we have a canvas. You just create that by clicking Game Object, UI, and Canvas. Although that's not really how I did it. The way that I did it was, here, let's just delete this and I'll show you. Let's go to Game Object, and then I went to UI, and I chose Text, because I needed a text object. Now that automatically created a canvas and put the text under it for me, so I didn't have to worry about that. I'm going to undo a couple times with Control Z and get my full canvas back out. Now, under the canvas, you notice that I have answer 1, 2, 3, and 4, and this text object. Let's look at the text first, since that's kind of the simplest part. And that's actually this text right up here that says new text. If I select it, you'll see the text says new text. If I put a 2 at the end, you'll see it now says new text 2. So this is where we're putting the text for the question and the answer. On top of that, we have these buttons here named answer 1 through 4. If you look here, when I select one, we have a button here, and it's got the image. Now these are created very similarly. I go to the canvas, right click, go to UI, and choose button. In fact, let's make a button number 5 while we're at it. And then I name it, and I'll name this one answer 5. I'm going to move it up here just so that it lines up in order with the other answer buttons. That was just dragging it right above. If you get it into the wrong spot or you accidentally make it a child like that, don't worry, just drag it back out, collapse that, and drag it right in between. So there we go, we've got answer 5 there, but you don't see it here. That's because the position of it is all off. So let's go to the scene view. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm just going to select that, go over the scene view, and hit F. And there we go. Now we can see where our UI is. And I'll zoom out and in with the mouse wheel. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit, right about there. And then hit W to move to the Move tool. You see that the Move tool right here got selected when I hit W. Now I grab the green arrow and just drag this button down here. So it's going to, it looks like it's going to be right around -100. In fact, I think I separated these all out by 50, so I'll just put in a -100 to make it nice and even. And I go back to my game view, and now I've got 5 buttons. So that's how the UI and essentially the entire scene is built, other than this quiz controller. Notice there's really nothing else in here. The event system, by the way, automatically added when we add our UI elements. So let's look at the quiz controller now. Like I said, these are just buttons. Here, in fact, let's scroll through them and see. All buttons, nothing set on them. Just blank, empty buttons. So let's look at the quiz controller now and expand out this script. See, there's a lot here. I'm going to collapse the questions. We'll hit that in just a moment. The first thing to note is that we have a question text element. So that is referencing this text object right there that just lit up. In fact, when I first created this quiz controller, this was empty. So it looked just like this with none. And to assign it, all I did was, while it was in a none state and the quiz controller selected, click, hold the button down, don't let go, and drag over to the text. If you click and let go, you'll see it selects it. So that's why you need to do that click and drag. So there we go. That's how I assigned the text. Now these buttons were a little bit different. When we first add this quiz controller, in fact, why don't we just do that? I'm going to collapse this quiz controller, and we're going to, with this quiz controller game object here selected, we're going to add the quiz controller script again. Now in our case, I already have one here, so this is going to be an issue, so I'm just going to unselect that to turn it off. Now we'll look at this fresh QuizController script. We'll assign the text object, and then we need to assign these buttons. So to assign the buttons, I can optionally drag them over one at a time and drop them on the word buttons. There we go, just like that. It's not usually how I do it though. What I like to do instead is click on the little lock right here. The lock makes it so that the inspector won't change what it's showing. So if I go click on these answers, notice the inspector is no longer changing. Then I'll go select answer 1, hold shift, select answer 5, click and drag and drop them all onto buttons, and you see it automatically filled them all in order. So I didn't have to do anything there. So that's how we set up our QuizController. Now I'm going to remove this extra one because this one right here is already filled out. And then I'll expand out the questions and we'll just take a quick look. So you see here that we have a total of 3 questions here. Although if we expand out this one, we really just have 2. That one's actually, the last one's actually empty. So the first question is, here, let's collapse these down. What city do you want to learn about? And as I expand it out, you'll see that we show question text, we show some answers, and then we show the responses to the answers. Then we have the next question. This one only has 2 answers and 2 responses, which is why we only saw 2 buttons. So let's actually look at the code now. I've gone through the whole scene view, kind of shown how everything's set up. Now I want to show how we actually program this to make it actually work and do something. So let's open it up. All of the code right now is in this single QuizController file. And this will be available for download if you want to go grab it and check it out and go through it, that's fine. There are 2 classes in here though. If we start at the top, you'll see that we have a QuizController class that's a mono behavior. This is the one that's going on to our actual game object. That is this script right here. But if we go down to the bottom, we also have a class that's a public class named question, and it has this serializable attribute on it. Now this is allowing our questions to show up in the inspector. So if I go back here to the inspector and we see our questions right here, the reason that they show up is because of that serializable attribute. Without that attribute, they won't be visible. So you have to make sure that you have that. Now to use the serializable attribute, you also need a using system statement right at the top. So if I go up to the top, you'll see that right there. All right, now that we have that covered, let's go through the actual QuizController class and see what it's doing. The first thing that we want to look at is on line 9, where we have our question text element. That's a private text object. And we have the serialized field attribute right above it on line 8. What's happening here is we're declaring this question text element as a text, that's the type, and we're saying that it's private because we don't want it to be modified by anything outside of this class. Now right now our project only has 1 class, but it's a good practice to mark things private if they shouldn't be modified by things that are, well, outside the class. In our case, well, we don't want anything modifying it, so we do that. But we do need to set it in the inspector, so we add this serialized field attribute. Now an alternative way to do that is to make this public and not have the serialized field attribute. While it is a little bit easier, it's generally just not a good practice because then other people working in your projects later could go in and accidentally misuse this thing. So here we're just making it safe for ourselves and others. Now the next thing below that, again another serialized field attribute, and on line 11 we have an array of buttons. You know it's an array because of these 2 square brackets here. This is what makes it show up with this number here and a size. So I can adjust the size. In fact, I can even turn it up to 5 and drop in our answer 5 button. Since we didn't have that in there, may as well do it. Now if this were not an array, if it were just a button like that, I'm not going to save. But if it were like that, we wouldn't be able to assign more than 1 button. We'd just have a single button. Not very useful. Our questions here on line 14 are the same way. We want to be able to assign as many as possible or as many as we need and not have to change our code. So right now it's set up so that we have an array of questions. Remember, question is that class that we had down below that's marked serializable so that all of these fields will show up. Below that, we have a current question index. Now you may notice in the method right below that we're actually using this to figure out just which question we're on. We start at question number 0, which is the first one here. So if we collapse these down, this first question is question 0, the next question is question 1, and the question after that is question number 2. Technically it's 1, 2, and 3, but generally in programming, we use zero-based indexes. So the first thing in a collection or an array is index 0, not index 1. So here we're keeping track of that, and we're setting the default to 0, which is our first one. And then we have a public question get current question. This is a method that returns back a question, and as the name implies, it should be the current question. So here we say var question. This just means variable. It could actually just say question like that with the proper class name there, but var is a shortcut. The compiler knows what it is. We know that it's a question because we named our things right. So we have this question right here, and we're assigning it to the question from this array at that index. So if I put the mouse over it, you see it's a question array. We're going at that index. So we're getting the first question the first time we call this. If we increment current question index to 1, we would be getting the second question, and so on. And then we return the question. Since our method takes a question, or requires a question to be returned, I should say, then we must return the question at the end. Otherwise, we'd have a compiler error. In fact, if I comment this line out, you'll see that we now get an error. Not all code paths return a value. And it even gets underlined telling us, hey, this isn't going to work. So we have this method, but we're not using it just yet. This is just set right here next to the current question index because they kind of work together. So let's look at what's actually making things happen then. So start is a method called in all mono behaviors, basically at the start of the lifetime of the object that it's on. So when our QuizController game object right here starts up, either in a scene or we spawn one or we load a level that has one, our start method will be called. First there's an awake, then there's a start, and there are a bunch of other ones, but we don't really need to dive too much into those. Start is a good one for us to use right here. So in start, we do two things. First, we initialize our buttons, and then we present the current question. Well, let's go through present the current question first. I know initialize actually happens first, but I think that part's a little bit more confusing and a little bit less interesting. So we're going to start with the next method, present current question. So imagine we've got a question, which is our first one right here. What's our first question? Actually, let's just go look at it. We don't need to use too much imagination. What city do you want to learn about? This is the first question object. The question text is, hey, what city do you want to learn about? Those are the answers, and these are the responses based on what they'll select. So the first thing we do is get the current question, and we put it into this question variable. Then we set the question text element's text value to the question's question text. It's a lot of question and text, so let's actually look at it real quick. So what we're doing is we're taking this text right here, the question text, that right there, and we're setting the text value of this text object. Kind of confusing, right? Let's rename this to header text. Actually, let's just rename this to header. So we're setting the text value of this header object, and let's unlock our inspector, this right here, to whatever that other text was. So essentially that line of code is taking this text right here, what city do you want to learn about, and it's putting it into this text field right here. Simple enough, right? So when we present the current question, we want to present the question right there. Then we loop through our buttons. So here we're doing a standard for loop where we define an integer to start with. We'll start with index 0, and we'll use the variable name I because that's a very common name for loops. I is pretty standard. If you're using something else, it should be a little bit more descriptive usually. But I is, like I said, very standard for going through the index or iterating through these. So we set it to 0, and then we have a semicolon for the condition. The condition says that if keep doing this while I is less than the number of buttons here, or the length of that array, which is 5 right now, and then each time through increment I by 1. Then we check to see if I is greater than the number of answers. Now we do this because we don't want to show buttons for spaces where we don't have answers. And if we look at our QuizController, right now on question 1, we only have 3 possible answers. So we want to make sure that we hide any buttons after that. So we're looping through each button, but then we're checking to see, hey, is this button a higher index than our max number of answers? If so, just set it to not active. So we call buttons at I, so getting the current button or the button of this index, We get its game object and we call setActive and pass in false to just disable that object. In fact, if I play right now, you'll see that answer 4 and 5 should get disabled. There they go. They're nice and grayed out. They're not actually visible here. And that's all that code right there. That's exactly what this is doing. Now, if that's not the case, so if I is less than that and we have a button for it, then what we need to do is get our answer text. So here I just call question, or I say string answer text equals question.answers at index I. So the first time through, it gets 0, New York, then 1, then Tokyo, and then, oh yeah, we ran out of buttons, so we won't get any more. Then we set the button to active, because we may have set it to inactive on a previous question. So we set active to true. Then we get component in children, and we get the text component. And then we set the text value to the answer text. Now this right here, this chunk of code right here to get the component in children of text and set the text is actually looking through here. So say we're looking at answer 1. It's on this object, it's finding any children that have this text component. Now luckily with a button we have 1 by default and only 1. So it's going to find this first one and always find the right thing. If we had multiple text objects, that might not work so well. So it's going to find this text and set the value here. So if I start typing here, you'll see it goes to button 2. And what it's doing the first time through is setting it to New York and so on. New York and London and whatever cities I randomly chose. So that's the entirety of presenting a question. That's how we present a question. There's nothing else to it. Just go through, set the text at the top, set the buttons, the button text. We don't have to do anything else really special. So let's look at initialize buttons. What makes it so that when we click on a button, the text changes, it shows something up at the top, and we continue on to the next question. In fact, before we go through the code, let's just play it one more time so you can see it in action. So we play, the header text shows up, we fill in the buttons, we've already seen that, and then let's pick Tokyo. So see a nice big long random fact about Tokyo, and then we go on to the next question. So let's take a look. Our initialize buttons method is what's handling setting up these button click events. So what we do again is loop through all of the buttons. This time we don't care about the answer length. We want to do this for every button. Then we just get the button right here. We say button equals buttons at I. We're just getting that button index. We could also do a for each loop. There are a bunch of different ways that we could loop through these buttons, but this one works pretty well. Then we create an integer named button index and actually assign it to I. This is a seemingly non-important part, but it will make a big difference. If you don't do this, it's not going to work right. And that's because the way that we're adding our listener here. So if you look at a button, it normally has an on-click section, and you can go in there and hit plus and add in listeners. In fact, let's take a look at that real quick. So if we go look at answer 1, we have this on-click section, and normally I can hit plus. I can drag a game object down there, and I can change something on it. Maybe make the object change its name, change its tag, set it to not active. In fact, here, we'll make it so that when I click, the text on here should disappear on button 1. Just by doing this little drag and drop thing. So I hit it, the text disappeared because it's no longer active. You get the idea. But generally, I don't like to do too much of that in here, especially when we're going to have something that's dynamic and changing the number of things that are going to be visible. So instead, what we do is we call button.onClick.addListener. And then we use a lambda expression right here. So everything inside these parentheses, this chunk right here, is a little lambda that allows us to just call this showResponse method and pass in our button index without having to write too much extra code. So this is kind of a shortcut around a longer way to do this. And then what's going to happen is whenever we click on the button, it's going to call showResponse for whatever the button index of that button is. So it's going to pass that right in. And that's method is right here, our showResponse method. So our showResponse method takes that button index, and then we get the current question. We set the text to the response at the button index. So let's look at that again. If we go into our project here and we go to the QuizController and we look at a response. So let's look at, that Tokyo response. So if we had picked button index 2, so 0, 1, and 2, we'd get response 0, 1, 2 right here, this Tokyo first settled one. And this is going to get set into that top header text. So you see right here we say question text element.text equals that response right there. Then the last thing we do is kick off a coroutine. The coroutine is responsible for moving to the next question, but first we want to give a little bit of a pause so the player or user can read the response that we gave them. So we call start coroutine, we give it the name of the coroutine and the parentheses, and then our coroutine must have an IEnumerator return type. If it doesn't have that, well, it's just not going to work. Now, if we don't have this line right here at the top as well, this using system.collections, well, let's comment it out and you'll see. Then our IEnumerator will be gray. We'll get some errors saying, hey, it's not found, or you missing a directory or a reference or something. And we hit Alt-Enter and just hit Enter to re-add that using statement. And I'm going to go up here and delete that commented one. So what does this do? Well, it does a yield return, wait for seconds, and waits for 3 seconds, essentially. So this line, if you've never used a coroutine before, what this is going to do is just wait for 3 seconds. Then we increment that current question index and present the current question again, going right back through that loop. So you can see here it's kind of a unending, scalable setup that'll just keep going through. Now we don't handle when we get to the end. If you want to actually build this into a project, you'll need to deal with what happens when we run out of questions. You're going to show a results screen or something else, who knows. But we are able to go through any number of questions and keep presenting them and keep giving them answers. We could also do other things with these answers. If you wanted to collect the results and maybe score them, we could add something like a public int array of response scores, like that, and then perhaps give these all a score inside the editor. Like each response could have its own score value, and then we could add up those as they answer questions. So whenever when they select a response, we could add it to a score, or perhaps even a bucketed type of scores or something, and then give them a different answer based on what types of things that they lined up with. All right, I hope that was helpful. Again, it's just one simple example of how we can set up some interactions here. If you're interested in learning more, make sure that you're subscribed and getting alerts, and even sign up for my email newsletter at Unity3D.college. We've got a Discord, Patreon, all kinds of stuff going on. And thanks for watching. Goodbye.